In the heart of an unforgiving winter, 8 fragile cubs faced the wilderness alone. The snow fell relentlessly, biting through their fur as they trembled in the cold. Their cries echoed through the empty forest, a desperate call for their mother, a call that went unanswered. Yet, even in the grip of fear and hunger, these cubs found strength in one another. Together, they stood against the storm. And now, let's begin the story. The well-known call that made all 8 cubs' ears instantly pricked up, although it was far away. But their mother's voice was distinct. The noise echoed through the woodland as if thunder that is strong and full of identifying the tiniest cub who had been laying in the snow raised, motionless. His siblings' heads a little, who had began to stray apart, frozen even in their bewildered, frigid, and cold tracks declare that everyone is familiar with the sound. The phone call had always meant their mother's love, warmth, and safety was the oldest cub is looking for them, gathered his remaining energy and roared in response, one by one. One of his siblings participated in their unified voices, ascending above the breeze. When compared to ours, their calls were faint. Previously, but they added the final bit of effort to be heard that the tiniest cubs could only tolerate silence. Whine. Yet even these heightened their frantic screams of the wolf that had been approaching, abruptly stopped. The cub's mother called closer this time. Her voice was warning at the moment that caused the entire forest to become quiet. The sound of heavy paws slamming onto snow came closer to their ears, speeding up. And more quickly through the whirling a big, black shape of snowflakes started to the cubs shuddered as they emerged, but this time from optimism rather than fear or coldness. Their mom emerged from the snowy like a natural force. Darkness, and she was among them for a few seconds, her big body protecting them from the wind's bitterness, her cozy fur against their frozen corpses. She hurriedly collected all 8 cubs, carefully inspect each one using little prods of her nose. The tiniest cub almost lost because she caught up a cold, fast and gently up in her lips. She guided them to a cave close by after she had gotten ready inside while she was away. The air was more comfortable and shielded from the shrieking wind, parched foliage, and gentle pine. The ground was covered in needles, forming a conceal oneself from the chilly stone floor. She groomed her cubs one by one, licking to their furs snow aids and blood warming, returned to their weary bodies as the sky was adorned by the first rays of morning. All 8 of the cubs were lying outside their cave, cradled in their mother's cozy body, is at last secure and warm after the cold and fearful night was ended, survived by remaining together and lending a hand, one other, and by maintaining hope at all times. Even if they were too little to comprehend, their close-knit siblings had become stronger as a result of their experience. Similar to the sun's first rays are now spreading, the story is stronger outside their cave. The survival of 8 bear cubs serves as a reminder to how valuable and delicate wildlife is in their struggle in this changing world against the bitter cold, and their determination to survive emphasizes the difficulties that many the hard winters that wild animals must endure. Our climate is becoming more human activity, and unpredictability impact on natural environments is growing. It is essential to safeguard these susceptible animals in their dwellings. Each tiny steps we take to protect their environment from sustaining wildlife conservation must be aware of our influence on forest regions, ensures that bear cubs and subsequent generations will possess secure spaces to develop, learn, and their story of thriving with their mothers is not only for survival, but also for us to improve as stewards of the natural world. Ensuring that view couldn't see them, the cubs had observed bewilderedly as when their mother moved gone. She glanced, returning to them one final time, her eyes anxious. Then she had moved into the white woodland and vanished. Swiftly, as though she was attempting to guide someplace distant from her cubs' location. The last time they had was when they were hiding. When I saw her, the snow had begun to fall. Soon after, she gradually hid her tracks, until no indication remained that she had ever. The cubs were there, and the hours went by slowly. Initially waited calmly, certain that their mom would be back any moment. But the sun's passage across the sky caused their patients began to worry about the temperature. Continued to fall, and the snow began to dropping more quickly from their hiding spot, which felt secure this morning, but now felt the wind made its way like a frigid trap, causing them to huddle through the bushes as the day grows warmer. They get closer together. Hunger started to bite at their bellies that their mother would typically have discovered food for them by now. The tiniest cub made an effort to recall what she had instructed them on how to locate berries under the snow, but he was afraid to go. In addition to the snow falling, the group now that any berries would be so heavy, too far down to feel the icy cold entered gradually at first. Then with more brutality as the afternoon turned into in the early evening, the temperature fell sharply, up to 8 degrees Celsius. Transforming the woodland into a frozen, the 8 bear cubs in Wasteland are still now, crouched in their hiding place, were battling the very elements of winter typically. Their fur is thick enough for winter days were unable to shield them from this bitterly cold snow had begun to accumulation on their backs, giving them of the second is like drifts of live snow. Cub the smallest began to quiver, so fiercely, making his teeth chatter, generating a noise that frightened his siblings. His sibling is only marginally larger than him. Pressed closer in an attempt to explain what she still had some warmth, but it wasn't the cold had become a way of life. Something looking for any space between them in order to keep its cold teeth buried in its claws. Too young and tender for such harshness, the pain had started to come from in the heavy snow. Standing, one of the middle cubs recalled how their mom would occasionally excavate in the snow to create a more comfortable area for them to sleep in. Began to scratch the earth with his tiny claws, scuffing the frozen ground. Two of his siblings participated in their awkward and desperate gestures. Yet for frozen solids, the ground was too hard by winter weeks. Their efforts merely wore them out. Them more, forcing them to inhale more forcefully. The oldest cub attempted to brave the cold air. Assume leadership, as he had observed there does he push his siblings' mother, urging them to take a small walk to maintain the flow of their blood. But dread had as much as the cold could freeze them in place. Every step they took brought them closer to hiding. Spot wanted to give up on the possibility that they're the smallest ones would be returned by the mother, had begun to sob in feeble tones. Transporting the air conditioning over the snow-covered forest, when the wind grew stronger introduced fresh noises that enhanced their fear makes hearts beat, and weird creaks and moans reverberated throughout the tree limbs. Swaying heavily with snow and ice, one fell perilously over them, close by, causing everyone to leap and scream. Their hiding place is no longer in terror. Felt secure, yet were too afraid to leave it. Hunger made things worse. They had eaten their last supper early that, and their immature bodies weren't accustomed to going so long periods without eating. The oldest cubs noticed bark on a tree close by, similar to the one their mother had provided them some food, but it was he stood too high for any of them to reach. Stretched as far as he could on his back legs could, although his claws only just touched as trees emerged. The cubs' cries became more intense. Darkness started to seep into the one of them yelled in his respective, some with high-pitched whimpers in their own manner, others who make deep, melancholy noises. Their combined voices formed a chorus that of despair that reverberated throughout the frozen forest. Yet there was no call or no stomping feet crunched through the no warm, recognizable figure in the snow toward them emerged through the snowflakes that were falling. The tiniest cub was no longer shivering, which caused his elder siblings to worry. They learned from their mother that shivering indicated that the body was attempting to stay warm. What did the shivering signify then? They pressed on him and halted. Every side attempting to share his eyeballs' residual body heat had increased. He struggled to keep them open despite the weight. His breathing seemed to be slower than the final one as darkness sank farther into the fear of the wilderness took over. Every shadow in the 8 cubs' minds looked each whisper of a moving monster. The youngest said the wind sounded like footsteps. Due to exhaustion, cubs had stopped crying, too chilly to create any additional sounds. Just their rapid, Shallow breathing indicated that they were still awake. The new darkness brought they had never experienced terrors like without the guardianship of their mother presence each night. The sound turned into a danger. An owl's abrupt cry caused them to everyone flinches and presses in closer. They had previously spotted owls, but always from their mother's side of protection. The piercing sound now brought to memory how little and defenseless. They were the cub. The third oldest began to shake, but despite being cold, he had seen two sparkling eyes in the shadows between the trees. His anxiety swiftly extended to the others. As they also observed the observation, none of them understood the nature of creatures. However, they recalled their mom's cautions regarding other animals the cubs tried hunting in the wild. Must minimize their size as much as feasible, wishing that their bodies wrapped in snow with minutes felt blending into the white ground as they waited for hours. Frozen with the eyes eventually vanished out of terror, although the cubs' minds were still filled with fear. Plenty with pictures showing all the dangerous creatures they learned from their mother concerning mountain lions, wolves, and other greater than themselves bears in the absence of mother. Each rustle of branches turned into a possible predator that the eldest cub attempted to show courage, but his honest fear was conveyed when a branch broke. He leaped someplace in the shadows just as siblings, like everyone else, had always sought his support, just as everyone turned to face their mother. But now he felt just as lost and afraid as they did. Efforts to console the others increased. Less strong since his own bravery failed him, the world had become smaller. An area in the woodland blanketed in snow, the cubs stopped considering looking for eating or warming up. They believed only about making it until the next morning each. Minute that went by without them, the reappearance of their mother eroded their. I hope the tiniest cub has halted, reacting to his siblings, prodding even though his heart was still palpable, pounding rapidly with terror at the depths of their apprehension. And a surprising coldness started when the 8 cubs were propelled by love, and instinct began to blossom between them. Cooperating in ways that their mother, the oldest, would have been proud to witness, Cub recalled how their mom used to set them up to sleep on chilly evenings, with the middle containing the tiniest cubs and the bigger ones outside with gentleness. Started shoving and prodding his siblings, the 2 smallest, into a tight circle. Cubs who were alarmingly silent were transferred to the middle, where they could get the greatest heat. The larger cubs alternated outside each other, faced in a different orientation, such as they couldn't, since their mother had instructed them combat the cold on their own, but collectively they might express their limited warmth. Cub, the second oldest, saw her go. The eyes of the youngest brother are beginning to. She recalled how their mother would keep themselves awake by brushing their fur. When they were exhausted, they used the remaining. She started licking the snow with her energy. 2 other cubs away from his face and ears participated in collaborating to maintain the snow accumulation on their siblings. Their tongues were chilly and exhausted. However, they failed to halt. One of the intermediate cubs began to make low, rumbling noises, comparable to the reassuring sounds when they were afraid their mother would create. Even though his voice was somewhat lower than the familiar sound of their mother, was helpful. Soothe his siblings as soon as possible. Cubs joined the collective humming, generating a little vibration that was beneficial to 5th cub, makes them feel less alone. Found that through paw stamping he was able to keep his feet rhythmically away from despite the weather. He displayed his brothers and sisters, and soon all 8 cubs were cautiously raising and lowering their. It wasn't much in return, but it maintained the flow of their blood. When one cub became too exhausted to move, so someone else would softly prod them, urging them to continue as the evening turned chilly. Their collaboration became increasingly important, alternated between being outside of their circle, ensuring that no cub had to spend too much time in the cold wind, while the youngest cub burst into tears once more. From cold and hunger, his siblings shared their body heat as they moved closer, and they had never needed their strength more than they did at the moment. New threats appeared at night. Testing the delicate unity of the cub, a fierce wind roared through the trees, raking away snow and flinging it against their skin like tiny, stinging needles. Features that require the cubs to narrow their eyes to shield them from the snow's sting, making the gloom seem much more profound, and the huge branches above them are more frightening, started to shake erratically as the sound of the woodland reverberated with the sound of wood shattering. As the wind increased, a big branch suddenly weighted down by snow and ice fell within a few feet from where the cubs hopped jet into the gathering. Fear, their shielding circle nearly swiftly dismantling the oldest cub, forced them to reunite. But the fear of the wind had ingrained itself deeply into their bones. Cut through the snow, producing around them, the white powder drift deeply, was now heaped to such an extent that it reached the smaller shoulders of the cubs. If they remained here for a lot longer in the snow, would totally bury them. But shifting entailed departing from the location where their mother had abandoned them, and that idea frightened them more than the snow falling. A fresh sound pierced the roaring wind. The cubs heard wolves howling in the distance, froze, their pulses pounding more quickly than Mother had consistently turned them off when she heard wolf cries. But they now had the howls appeared to emanate from nowhere, from every angle, bouncing off the snowbanks and trees till the cubs was unable to identify the actual danger. Perhaps the temperature even fell lower, giving the impression that the air itself, their breath, became into ice in their lungs. Every time you breathe in the cold air, it hurts. The little cub was burning their throats, had begun to produce wheezing noises that frightened his siblings, letting his breath go. Like little puffs that became weaker as the minute went by, ice began to form on their whiskers, are now clinking slightly. Noises as their heads moved in the cub's darkest hours before dawn approached their tipping point. The tiniest cub fell into the snow. Legs that could no longer support him, siblings made a valiant effort to keep him standing and pressing into his sides, but he hardly reacted when they touched him. The hardly open eyes revealed only a small sparkle in the shadows the second the tiniest cub started to wobble. Her body was shaking so badly that she couldn't remain in the circle of protection. Whenever her siblings pressed near support her, she would falter into the cold, had a different direction. She continued turning her head in confusion, head back and forth, as though I can't recall where she was or why. They were present. The gang began to panic as they seen the failure of their weakest siblings. The senior cubs made a valiant effort to recall all of their mother's possessions, taught them how to endure chilly evenings. However, nothing seems to be helpful anymore. Their own strength was rapidly diminishing. Stiff bodies from prolonged standing in the wolf howls intensified in the frigid snow, closer, sounding more ravenous, and assured one very loud howl caused the cubs to shudder in terror. The oldest cub made an effort to look tall and courageous, but his legs were trembling as well. He could hardly keep his own eyes open, not to mention defend his brothers, and for the first time, he emitted a cry that wasn't merely a request for it was a wail of utter anguish. Mama. 3 of the cubs in the middle started, stumbling in mental circles, bewildered by the chill and anxiety. They struck one another, shattering the circle of protection that had preserved them alive thus far. The unity of the group started to disintegrate as fatigue and the cold took over. Their determination to remain together, a few cubs began to stray a short distance, leaving their brains too numb to recall why they had to remain near. The forest surrounding them had turned into a frozen crystals of nightmare ice drifted into what little light theirs reflected by the air was giving the impression that the darkness was glistening. But this beauty was every sparkle signaled a new drop, which was fatal. Temperature one more step toward froze, right when it seems like there was no hope. Something other than the roar of the wind captured their interest through the shadows, a profound. The cold was merciless as it fell in the middle of a snowstorm to 8 degrees Celsius. 8 naked cubs stood in a covered forest, their tiny bodies together, now looking like tiny snow hills. Every time more snowflakes were brought by the minute that made them tremble by adhering to their fur. The frigid air was filled with their cries. 8 distinct voices demanding the same thing with their youngest mother, could not keep his legs and eyes open, trembled so violently that his elder siblings had to exert pressure to hold him. His sister, who was standing beside him, attempted her back to shake off the snow, but it was useless. More snow continued to fall. Covering their breath came to them repeatedly, out in little white clouds that swiftly vanished in the gloomy atmosphere. Never before had these 8 cubs been by alone. Previously, their mother had consistently been her large, warm body was there to protect them from the cold, preventing her from their anxieties, but the woodland now seemed enormous, and emptiness around them. They're starving. The cold wind stung, and the bellies hurt. At their noses and ears, they remained in their current location, recalling how they learned from their mother to wait if when they parted ways. The eldest cub, in an attempt to be brave, he walked around his siblings, driving each other closer, attempting to keep them toasty. But he was simply his own wail, as terrified as the others joined theirs with a melancholy rumble that as night approached, it reverberated through the trees. As they got closer, their calls became more urgent. A few cubs shouted out in fear, voices, while some produced melancholy, deep tones. The entire forest seemed to be made even more depressing. Everything had been altered since the 8 cubs woke up. Curled up, feeling warm and secure again, she had been covered in their mother's thick fur, instructing them on how to survive the cold, for finding food under the snow for a few weeks, how to remain together and maintain. Their mother was experienced and loving, cautious, constantly keeping an eye on them with eyes of patience, as they discovered there none of them could have a forest home. Aware that today would be a test, all of the knowledge they had gained that morning had begun similarly to other winter days. They had been guided by their mother during their routinely instructing them on brushing, putting the snow aside, locate the remaining berries if she showed them the winter hiding underneath, whose bark from trees they may consume if they hungry, and unsure whether its ice was sufficiently thick for the cubs to walk on, enthusiastically followed her with their tiny paws, creating little footprints in the newly fallen snow. Bigger is the one causing the trouble behind her. Began when the head of their mother, her nose twitched as it shot up. She sensed something in the chilly air that caused her entire body to become rigid. Cubs observed her pacing back and forth, gazing off into the horizon, as the trees got thicker. Her actions were odd because she had never behaved in this manner. Prior to then, she continued to provide low warning noises, advising them to remain near. Her leg was rubbed against by the tiniest cub. Her muscles were shaking with tension, followed by the altering noise. It wasn't a forest sound at all, such as the sound of ice breaking on branches, or that this sound was the winter bird's call. Anything distinct that didn't belong. Their mother's eyes possessed a universe of their own, widened in terror, her ears twisting in every direction as she attempted to follow where the noise originated. She had led them rapidly to a tiny dip in the ground with dense bushes. Imploring her, she had softly pressed them together with her nose.